Hi, everybody. My name is Dave Roth. I'm a partner at Citron Cooperman. I joined about 3 weeks ago in our track practice. I used to be at PwC for 27 years and helped build and lead the IT risk and cybersecurity and privacy practice. We have a really good set of topics today. Lizzie, if you could go to the next page of the agenda. So we'll give you just sort of a high level of what this is about. We'll help walk you through and help understand some of the financial and the fraud risks. We've seen a lot of challenges with different hackers and different frauds coming up with people working from home. There's been a lot of phishing attempts, a lot of penetration attempts, and we'll walk you through some of those things and also how to better protect yourself. We'll also talk a little bit about some of the recession-related considerations of what we foresee the environment to be like and some things and elements to be considering. We'll talk about the IT and the cyber risk, and we have different presenters for each of these, but we'll let them introduce themselves during their topics. We'll talk a little bit about the working from home implications, additional recession-related considerations, from a security perspective and a privacy perspective, and then some other overall IT implications. We'll talk a little bit about some of the legal aspects, and then we'll open this at the end for any questions and answers. And if you have any questions during the presentation, you can please enter it into the chat box. Some of the questions here, and we'll do a little polling for some continuing education. Are your concerns around fraud and cybersecurity risk heightened since the COVID-19 onset? And you can just answer in the box. Okay, 84% of the participants said yes, and then 18% said no. Okay. I'll turn this over to Ken Yormark. Ken, it's all you.
So thank you very much, Dave. Morning, everybody. I hope you're all sitting comfortably in your homes with your cup of coffee, with your dog to you or your child next to you, and trying to stay through this challenging time. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about the aspects of fraud with regard to COVID-19 and where we see the focus and some of the preventive measures that we can discuss. So first thing I'd like to do is just discuss really the unfortunate realities of today with regard to the factors of fraud, and initially trying to talk to you a little bit about what's known as the fraud triangle, which really is a three-section aspect of how to really perceive fraud. So you've got the pressure side of things. We've been reading a lot recently about higher spousal abuse, enhanced drug and alcohol problems. We've got 22 million people that have been filing for unemployment in the last few weeks. And those who are still working are feeling it as well. Potentially they've had reduced salaries, or they're worried about the idea of them being the next person who's going to lose their job. Companies are out there and stressed. They're filing for these forgivable loans. So there's an enormous amount of personal financial pressure or work-related pressures that people are under today. With that, you look at the concept of rationalization, where people find rational reasons to do things that they might not have done in the past. Where they're looking at the idea that their company might be performing poorly, and it's is it possible for them to save their company or keep their company alive by potentially committing some management fraud or falsifying various financial records? And then there's the component that really the only one that we as company people can control is the opportunity side of things, the perception that there might potentially be an opportunity where, you know, somebody might say to themselves, you know, if I were to take a look and maybe check the process, will anybody be noticing? Will anybody find out that in fact I've done this bad deed? You know, so removing any one of these components of the fraud triangle really would make it less likely that fraud could occur. But really, an organization can only control the opportunity aspect. And I want to talk a little bit about what I call the 20-60-20 rule, because that you've got 20% of the world, the population, where the person would never ever conceive of doing anything bad. They're just no matter what, if they found you know, $100 bill on the street, they would be looking around trying to find the person whose $100 bill it was. You know, and then you've got the other side of the scenario, the 20% that are really always thinking about trying to figure out an angle, trying to find a way to you know, better themselves by doing something dastardly. And quite honestly, those are the kind of people that will always keep me in business. Then there's the 60% in the middle. And those 60%, if in fact they have one of these pressures, you know, the perceived pressure, or they can try and find a way to rationalize the logic behind doing something that they might never have thought about doing before, they might take a step and potentially go to that bad side. And today, more so than ever, it's important for us to control that 60%, that universe in the middle, which potentially could do something which could cause craziness or havoc to your organization. Let's go to the next slide. So, you know, we have to salute all of the people that are still at work out there for us, and I think that hopefully, you know, when this is all over, we will look at, you know, the person who's that grocery store clerk, or the person working at that pharmacy, and say thank you to them when we get back to being, you know, at their store on a regular basis. But, you know, all of these people, the warehouse workers, the grocery store attendants, the doctors and nurses, and all of the other hospital workers that are out there, the people who come to our houses and deliver product on a daily basis, and then, you know, the emergency workers, you know, they're all people who I think about as potentially taking advantage and potentially misappropriating assets. You know, and I look at that 20% that are always on that bad side, and the 60% in the middle. You know, many of these heroes are lower paid workers. You know, and they're happy to have the work that they have, but it really might be very stressful, and they might need some additional monies as a result of the circumstances that we're all in. These warehouse workers and the grocery and pharmacy workers, you know, where they're working today, I guarantee you there is less oversight than there has been in the past. There are limited crews in those warehouses, and there certainly is excess activity and lots of chaos. And certainly as a result of that, there's probably less control that's taking place. And then you look at the hospital workers. I mean, the amounts of product that is being received on a daily basis in all of these different locations, incredibly expensive products with incredibly high demand on the outside, which could easily be picked up and sold on a website for large dollars. You know, I mean, what's going to happen when a hospital slows down and there are all these ventilators that are there, and nobody really knows how many of them there are or where they all are? You know, what would stop a person from taking that ventilator and then putting it on eBay and selling it for several thousands of dollars? Let's go to the next slide. So some of the internal control questions that we really need to be thinking about are, you know, today with the changes in the way we are structured, where we're a remote society today, you know, what kind of controls do we have in place, and are they operating effectively? Are they operating differently? You know, with workforce reductions, do you have gaps in your internal controls where you never had gaps before? And I think it's really essential that every company needs to evaluate the process and the procedures that they have in place currently, not what they had in place in the past. You know, there are lots of things that we need to consider in this environment, but one of the key things is that you need to heighten the levels of control you have over your assets, over your inventory management, your payroll structure, and definitely your financial reporting. You know, there are certainly all of these objectives are challenging, but the key thing is knowing that you have the right policies and procedures in place, that they're being reviewed on a regular basis, and check to see if any revisions need to be made. You know, you could be losing people at any point in time. Are there alternative controls that are being put in place? Making sure that if individuals might not be available for the work that they currently are doing, is there somebody else that can step in who's available to take over that procedure in a fashion that's effective? Next slide, please. So some of the things that we're all having to deal with it when we're dealing with working from home considerations, you know, obviously there's a very strong possibility that there's going to be reduced oversight. So I think that communications across an organization is really critical today. I think that conveying the message to all the parties that work for you on a regular basis, what's happening within your organization, the status of the operations that you have is real. Miscommunication or lack of communication, I think will really affect the way people in your organization feel about things and could be their stress. We certainly have enough stress today. We don't want that to be enhanced. The one big key concern that I see from this is really the non-compliance aspect relating to accounting standards, relating to specific regulations that we all have. Excuse me. I see that, you know, within the financial reporting scenarios, I mean, how are the auditors who come in on a regular basis to do your work, how are the auditors going to audit? I can tell you right now that plaintiff law firms are sitting back and preparing to probe, you know, all the changes in circumstances that are being disclosed within your organization. And they're looking for angles. They're looking for angles where they might eventually be able to assert fraud is taking place within your organization, where potential for cooking the books and propping up your company to make it look healthier than what it might be, certainly could be a scenario that is taking place as we speak. Next slide, please. So I think that, you know, I'm sure that Mike is going to touch about some of these remote workforce controls. And the thing that really scares me is the increased access that people have with regard to their systems. You know, the current controls aren't necessarily being revised in a proper way. You know, the fact that there are users that might have increased access as a result of their job responsibilities having changed, or where you're losing people, and as a result of that, there's a clear lack of segregation of duties. You know, all of these things could potentially perpetuate a long-standing fraud aspect. Next slide, please. So one of the key components that we have to think about is how to anticipate what is going to happen, looking at what the situation is today and evaluating that and anticipating what we might want to be looking for going forward. With all of these various different funds that are taking place today, most of them are being structured where it's a self-certification process. Now, there's clearly a penalty of perjury if you don't provide the right information, but there is certainly a real risk that people are not going to be all that concerned about that with the desperation that they might be feeling, and the fact that so many of these funds are being thrown out there in a way where we feel like there isn't a real great structure as far as the due diligence that's being done, the fact that the procedures are not in place from a compliance perspective, where we should be building effective controls for these types of funds being distributed. But the emergency factor is basically telling us that that's not the case. The CARES Act, for example, provides for the creation of an inspector general to ensure that the funds are being used properly. And I'm sure that at the end of the day, the SEC and the DOJ will be partnering with the Inspector General to prosecute on some of these claims. But the magnitude is just overwhelming. And I truly believe that the emergency relief fund frauds are likely to involve falsifications of financial records. There's no question in my mind that people are realizing that the magnitude of these issues and the magnitude of all of these claims is going to put an incredible burden on the government. So I think that one of the key aspects that should be focused on is, putting in an early warning detection system in, really trying to focus on putting in procedures and processes so that there's an ability to monitor and track these claims and analyze them and look for anomalies, look for the unusual, look for the oddities, so that we could use an AR type of a process to be able to find and understand the kinds of frauds that potentially are taking place. I'm not sure that that's taking place today, unfortunately. I think that what we're seeing is an abundance of funds being thrown out to all those who need it. But these types of mitigation practices are not really being the number one focus. Next slide, please. So I like to say that when the river runs low, you typically end up starting to see the rocks. You start to see things evolving, and in these kinds of potential frauds, you oftentimes will see during times of crisis or economic downturn where these frauds do end up coming to the surface. Ponzi schemes are a perfect example of them. I think that you're going to see, with regard to insider trading, the incredible fluctuations in the stock market over the last month would obviously lead to the possibility that when people know what's happening on the inside, the documentation is there as far as emails and the transactions that are taking place in organization. I would be surprised if we're not going to see insider trading issues, financial advisor frauds, where people are coming forward with the issues that would typically be set up for people who have they're in a feeling of desperation, and the financial advisors are taking advantage of that. I mentioned already the idea of employee theft and embezzlement. I think that what you're going to find is that there will be an enormous amount of companies that will be lacking the kinds of controls that they need. And I think that one of the things that we have to be thinking about from an organizational perspective is listening to what our clients are saying, listening to what our own internal people are saying, trusting the fact that when they're talking to us, that we are going to do something effective and efficient to find out whether in fact what they're saying is truthful. Looking at these whistleblower claims that might be coming through on the hotlines, and establishing whether in fact they are or are not valid. Anomaly testing is going to be something that's going to be very, very effective. I think that that will really be something that will be beneficial from an analytical perspective. We'll be able to see all of these outliers, and determining where additional controls might necessarily be needed. I think that we should be constantly looking at the shape of our organizations today, because they're changing on a regular basis. And we have to be conscious of the fact that once things change from an employee perspective or from a responsibility perspective, that there's a gap. And we have to constantly be analyzing those pieces of the puzzle. The story here is that we're not gonna see the end of this for quite some time. I envision that this will be rolling out over the course of many, many months, and we'll probably start to see the results of it only after the crisis takes a lull. And now I'll pass it over to Mike. Oh, first we're going to take our polling question. So this is a tough one. Do you require CLE credit? We've given it 15 seconds. A yes or a no answer should satisfy you. We're going to close this down now and let's see the results. Okay, so we've got 37% of the people online are the attorneys. And we're going to close this now, and I'll pass it off to Mike.
All right, thanks, Ken. My name is Mike Camacho, and I'm a partner in Citrin Cooperman's Technology, Risk Advisory, and Cybersecurity, or TRAC practice, specializing in cybersecurity, compliance, outsourced internal audit, and other advisory services. I've been based in our Providence office for about 16 years, and prior to that, I spent 8 years in the Big Four. My focus and skill set has always been understanding internal controls and cybersecurity risk, and being able to translate those into business risk and implementation strategies for companies ranging from small family-owned business to large multinational companies. So today we're going to spend some time this morning talking about the elevated IT and cybersecurity risk, which have resulted from the COVID-19 pandemic and our current financial crisis. But I'd like to start by highlighting that even before the world turned upside down, from a cybersecurity perspective, we were already under siege. I like to start by going over the statistics that are up on the screen right now. 5 billion records were lost or stolen or exposed in 2018. There's a cyber attack approximately every 39 seconds. Some of the crazy ones, average number of days to detect a breach is 206 days. That's over 6 months between the time that a hacker gets into someone's system and when it's detected. The real scary part is that a lot of the times the detection is not by the company itself. It's by someone outside the company, a vendor, a client, a bank, someone like that. And on top of it, it takes an additional 73 days to contain that breach, another 2.5 months from the time you figure out you have a breach to getting yourself back to where you started in the first place. 75% of healthcare industry have been infected with malware. 43% of cyber attacks target small businesses. This dispels the old theory that this only happens to the big guys. And then one of the most kind of emerging trends, 91% of breaches are the result of phishing attacks. Now this is much different than say 5-10 years ago, where hackers were attacking your hardware because they can get through a firewall. Now they're going after your weakest link, which is the employees. And then finally, the cost of data breach and the dollars, both in reputational, is huge. It's $150 per record stolen is the current cost of a data breach. And given the fact that an average breach has 25,000 records stolen, it quickly adds up as that's a little over $3 million of potential costs for a data breach for an organization. Now, a lot of the stats I just told you about are global statistics published by Verizon and Poneman, but to bring it a little closer to home, with our experience in 2017 and 18, Citron Cooperman helped 3 clients respond to cyber incidents or a breach. In 2019 alone, we helped 17 clients in the response to a cyber attack. And so far in 2020, we've helped 4 clients. So you can see this is on the rise. From a standpoint of risk, we're going to start by talking about some of the risks of working from home, starting with the security weaknesses of your home networks. So pre-COVID, our clients typically had less than 20% of their workforce with access to VPN or virtual private network. Just as a reminder, VPN is a private encrypted connection between your computer and the remote VPN server in your office, making it harder for communications and data to be tracked while you're online. With the onset of COVID, this really thrust companies into uncharted territory, having to give most or all of their employees the ability to work from home securely. Typically speaking, when you're setting up a VPN, it should be protecting your communications between the computer and the office, but in the rush of VPNs being set up as the world shut down, that always wasn't the case. First of all, your computer and communications are only protected while you're on the VPN. So for example, when you fire up your computer and you're not on the VPN, you're exposed because you're simply connected to your home network. Also, when VPNs are typically set up, they're configured to allow for one network connection from your computer at a time. So for example, that's why when sometimes you're trying to print to a wireless printer at home on a VPN, it doesn't work. However, sometimes if configured differently, you can have a split connection where you can be connected to your VPN and your home network, allowing your computer to talk to both networks at the same time. This could have an exposure to your device or your corporate network if someone's infiltrated your home router and network. And then finally, in a lot of cases, if you aren't alone in the house, if you're not alone in the house, weaknesses or vulnerabilities which impact your family members' devices could be a risk to your network if, in fact, their device is visible to your device. Secondly, the consumer-oriented online services is also another risk. There's been a huge spike in the use of online services, both for the personal and business purposes. On a business side, the use of online data storage or cloud-based backup utilities without consideration of the risks or the controls in place by those service organizations running those tools is causing additional risk to hit companies. Those decisions to go to those online services shouldn't be done without validating the controls in place by those service providers, which is typically done by reviewing their service organization controls report or a SOC report. This is just a report with an opinion by a CPA that tells that the controls over the security and confidentiality of data to which that service provider has access is designed and operating effectively. On top of the typical business use, the impact of personal use of consumer-oriented services is also impacting the efficiency and effectiveness of security of your computer. So when you're online, again, you may have a spouse, a kid, some of your kids, roommates who are also online, which significantly slow the connections that you have to the internet and expose your network to vulnerabilities. Additionally, there's also been a spike in phishing attacks on organizations. Things like emails coming from the CDC alerts, health or advice emails, government stimulus list notifications, or IRS notifications. All these things that people may be expecting to see, and thus they're more likely to click on them since they're at home. An important takeaway here is the importance of education of the employees to really identify when you're being attacked. And we're going to talk about more of that in a minute. Next slide, please. Another weakness point is endpoint security. So when you're working from home, there's a higher amount of risk being outside the office because when you are in the office, there are tools and applications monitoring the network while you're working. When you're at home, your perimeter security that you normally would see in your office is virtually ineffective, having been replaced by usually cheaper home routers protected by easy-to-guess passwords. Detection is often limited to on-device detection tools such as an antivirus program, which may not be configured correctly to be getting most timely updates. So if you're only getting updates on a weekly or monthly basis, there could be vulnerabilities that have come up in the last few days or the last few weeks that could impact your system. Because of this, also the time to identify a security issue or respond to the issue is higher than the stats that I presented at the beginning of the presentation. And so in that case, proper system configuration is going to be key during this era of working from home. The unsecured transfer of data is another risk to talk about. While employees are relocated or have to sitting at their house, they don't have immediate access sometimes to their desktop or their data that they would normally have on their servers. So what they're doing is using other devices to transfer data unsecurely. For example, flash drives, emailing data to personal email accounts or devices, or personal cloud-based solutions. All of these things obviously have security risks and could have a significant impact on the security of the data as well as compliance, given the fact that you now have sensitive data that's in the wild. And then finally, the employee trainings. I mean, it really comes down to all the risks we've talked about here. Employee training is key. Many of the risks discussed could be mitigated if employees are effectively trained. They are our weakest link, evidenced by the statistics we talked about earlier. And if your employees have not had any kind of cybersecurity awareness training before the onset of COVID, that risk is really amplified at this point. Such training really should include strategies for securely working at home, identifying phishing attacks, and what to do if your system's been compromised. And it's really not too late if you're looking at this point. Effective cybersecurity training programs focused on current risks and even customized to your business are easy to ramp up and to get set up in a very quick manner. Switching over to recession implications, very similar to what Ken was talking about earlier. Good people can be motivated to do bad things when pushed into a corner. Employee fraud and sabotage has always been a risk, but in our current situation, it really elevates all three sides of that fraud triangle that Ken talked about earlier. An employee who's been significantly impacted from a financial crisis might be under higher pressure to do something out of character, or a terminated employee might search for opportunities to sabotage your systems because they feel empowered to do so after, say, being furloughed or laid off by an employer. So some of the more typical scenarios we see start with financially impacted employees. Typically, when an employee has been financially impacted, they're looking for quick ways or potentially quick ways to get access to cash. That could be through cash, through investments, through conversion of assets into cash. Really, this causes a focus, and companies really have to focus on access to applications which give employees ability to hit those areas. So really to manage cash or convert items to cash. Additionally, disgruntled employees and file sabotage, another big area. Access security really has to be closely monitored during these periods of time. And what are employees looking at or doing, especially those who potentially feel that they're could be terminated or could be furloughed. It may give them the impact or ability to think that they need to retaliate against business operations. And even most importantly, if in fact you do have workforce reductions, timely deactivation of access is imperative to avoid potential opportunities for fraud or damage or theft of data. Next slide, please. So some other IT security implications here to touch on briefly. Nation states, and we've all heard about the risks of countries like China or those from Eastern Europe trying to hack into systems of the US companies at their weakest point. We've done several speaking seminars over the past couple of years with the FBI and can say that this is the first thing they talk about, that they spend a significant amount of their time on focusing on nation states, on the impact of US businesses. And we've already seen, right after COVID had launched, the Department of Health and Human Services had a breach attempt which slowed down their network, didn't get in, but definitely slowed it down. We've seen several that we'll talk about in a bit with certain clients that have already had incidents. Companies just being more focused on ensuring their networks are appropriately being monitored and detecting attacks before it's too late. Monitoring needs to be active and persistent, just like the attacks that are coming from overseas. Secondly, supply chain and third-party vendors. We touched on this a little bit a few minutes ago, but really at home now, companies are relying more and more on third-party vendors. Many companies have tightly controlled environments where they're applying standard protocols day to day when they're in the office. But now in the stay-at-home era, breaking those protocols in the spirit of conducting business or, say, collecting your cash is increasing the amount of risk. So, for example, sending contracts through an unsecured communications method, or accepting credit card payments where you may not have accepted those before. All these things can expose a company's data to a new set of risks, potentially not contemplated when everyone was working from the office. Not only does it put the data at risk, but the transfer or collection of sensitive data remotely could impact compliance. So if you think about right now what's happening in the healthcare industry with telehealth, you're going from having a face-to-face visit with the doctor being replaced by having confidential discussions, say, over Skype. So the long-term potential implications on compliance areas like HIPAA, or for people who accept credit cards, the payment card industry data security standards will become a focus down the line. And the greater reliance on the third-party vendors, such as IT support related without proper vetting of the controls. We talked about the SOC report earlier. This was already a risk pre-COVID, so it's something we really can't afford to ignore now. So I'd like to finish off with just a few examples of how this is real, because people always, seeing it in real life, it often helps. So we have 4 quick examples here. One, we had a client of ours who used Office 365, which is known to be one of the more secure email methods that are out there. It also happens to be one of the most frequently used phishing mediums as well. And had a client who, one of their locations, had somebody get an email that asked, said that their Office 365 credentials were expiring and that they needed to enter their new password. So they entered their username, their old password, and their new password twice, as we all have to do when it's real. Unfortunately, it was a phishing attack. So the person then had access to their email account and they logged in and they sat there and basically watched for like 5 months, watching how transactions got done, watching when they did close process and account reconciliations, watching to see how payments would be authorized, what signatures looked like, what the wire transfers looked like, and then waited till a downtime with this organization. And in essence, over a course of 2 weeks, when people weren't doing bank reconciliations because they were on vacation, was able to get a sizable amount, almost $1 million out of the company in a short period of time. This is really where you see a cyber vulnerability end up with an internal control exploit. So it's why those two things definitely overlap. Second one, similar situation, another case where somebody phished an organization, this time using a phishing email from a Web Connect, which is in essence one of those tools that your outsourced IT provider will use to log into your computer to take control of your screen and help you fix an issue. Well, that person got an email saying that they had to update their drivers for a Web Connect. They clicked on it, and all it did was plant a phantom version of Web Connect on their system. And that hacker spent the next 6 months basically beating around the system overnight, trying to find confidential files, trying to download things they thought were important. At the end of it, they really weren't able to get anything because they were so frustrated, they decided to destroy the network. And what they did is they basically deleted all applications, deleted all data. And then because they had figured out what the admin password was, they were able to log into the remote backup system and delete all the restore points and backups. So a case, again, where one case where they didn't even really get data, but they were able to, their ultimate destruction of the data was very costly to the organization. A more recent one that at the expense of a good friend of mine who also has to be a CFO of a company, Facebook blunders and the importance of using social networks. This is a case where I think everyone probably saw over the past few weeks in LinkedIn and in Facebook, people posting pictures of their new COVID quarters at home for work. And in this case, my friend's wife had gone over her shoulder and taken a picture of him to post on Facebook. Little did she know there were 2 screens with Excel documents open with financial information. So luckily, I'd seen it and gave him a call, and I think he attempted to furlough his wife, which didn't go over well, but still it was a bad situation caused by someone not knowing what was in the background of what they were taking pictures of. And then finally, the weakest link. We talk about employees, and this is one that was somewhat recent where a client had an employee open a phishing email and it started activating and started encrypting files. They happened to notice it right away, unplugged their system, took the laptop to IT, had them look at the computer, and they said, no, it's encrypted your system. We're going to fix it, but in the meantime, here's a loaner. The person took the loaner computer, went back to the network, plugged in, opened their email, and clicked on the same email again. That email then did, unfortunately, not get unplugged from the network at that time because he didn't notice it encrypting. It ended up going through and encrypting every single file on the company's network. It took them 3 weeks to recover. So just some examples to put to some realism to some of the risks that we've talked about over the past few minutes. With that, I think we're going to switch to our third polling question. So would you like additional information about protecting the people, data, and technology from your company from heightened cybersecurity risk? It's an easy yes or no. We'll leave it open for like 15 seconds. Has the question popped up? I haven't seen it on this side.
Yes, it's running.
Okay. Give about 5 more seconds. All right, if we can close the poll. So it sounds like 72% of people are interested in additional information, and 30% are not. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Ari Berman, who's going to talk about some legal considerations during these uncertain times.
Thanks. I hope I'm unmuted. I'll pause for a minute for someone to tell me yes.
Sounds good.
Great. Thanks, and thanks to the folks at Citron Cooperman for having me here. I really appreciate it. I'm a partner at the Pillsbury Law Firm. I'm a litigator in the New York office. I do a variety of commercial securities, government investigation type work. Basically, the legal angle to a lot of this stuff that our friends were talking about over the last 30 or 45 minutes. And I like hearing the sort of real world stories in terms of not being able to teach stupid, because it's what keeps folks like me in business when the dust clears and the government either investigates misconduct from a cyber IT perspective, or private litigants take issue with companies not having adequate control. So it's a nice segue into the legal, considerations, and we can flip to the next slide. So, we get a lot of calls these days across the firm and across the industry as to like, what should we be doing in light of the pandemic? And the quick answer is you should be doing a lot differently, but also nothing differently. And on some level, that's a pretty vague and unspecific answer, but in many ways, it just captures the situation, which is a bit of uncertainty. So when there's chaos in the air, I tend to tell clients that blocking and tackling becomes really important. Doing the basic stuff that we heard spoken about for the first part of this presentation in terms of tightening controls, tightening compliance, ensuring employees are following policies and procedures and the like. Basically, the mundane running of an operation becomes even more important when folks are scattered and remote. And what I'm hoping to do in the next 10 to 15 minutes is touch upon some of the most important legal considerations from a high level, mindful that we have a disparate group of folks in the audience, so to speak, some in different industries, some different size companies, and I'll try to capture it from different perspectives, both from a management perspective, from those who may serve on boards who have to deal with boards of directors, those who are in investment firm situations and may serve on boards of a portfolio or investment company, and then obviously happy to answer any questions offline or follow up. But let's move along to the next slide, please. So this is, again, an overview. And you'll hear some of these themes, come out over the next few minutes. And I don't intend to dive deep into a lot of these areas or slides, but I wanted to lay it out so you get a feel for the types of issues that we've been bombarded with over the last, 4 to 6 weeks. So big picture, it's important to stay in closer than usual contact between boards, management, and other key personnel within a company. Sounds trite, but executing on that is easier said than done. So we've seen a number of clients form, COVID-19 committees to make sure that they meet regularly, make sure communications are tight. Even though folks are offline in many ways, they're more online than ever before. So it's almost easier to have regularly scheduled calls and meetings, save for having to juggle, kids coming in and out of rooms or dogs barking in the background. And on cue, I think my dog just started barking. In terms of, companies' policies and procedures, again, this is not the sexy part of running a business, but I'll share my personal philosophy on that, which is it's one thing to have the best policy and procedure, whether it's in cyber IT, like we were talking about earlier, or another fraud prevention like insider trading and Ponzi schemes and the like. It's one thing to have the greatest internal policies and procedures in the world. It's another to stick them in a desk drawer and let them collect dust. So I like to say it's better to be realistic than aspirational. So, to sit down and form a task force of the greatest minds in your company and say everyone's going to meet every day and we're going to follow these policies and this game plan, but not actually execute on it, is akin to, what my beloved New York Jets do, where they draft up a play and then the receivers all run the wrong way. It doesn't look very good. So it's better to have something that's realistic that you could adhere to. If you're going to say you're going to meet every day, do it. If you're going to have regular board level briefings, do it. If regular to you means once a week or every 3 days, that's okay. There's no one industry standard, but clearly the standards are shifting. Let's move along. This is a slide talking about the importance of oversight. And of course, that's both from a management perspective and a board, which is charged, as you know, legally with overseeing the affairs of a company. And what I would say as a punchline for this is that the standard amidst this pandemic is that the expectation is greater for board members than before. Some of those reasons are obvious, but mostly it's because during a time of crisis, you expect directors to keep stronger tabs on management and management to keep stronger tabs on the subordinates in the company to ensure that the system is being implemented and ensure that company operations are occurring and you're considering all alternatives that you need to from a legal, compliance, accounting, regulatory perspective during the crisis. So I would say everyone should be raising the bar as opposed to lowering the bar. And from a litigation perspective or from a government regulatory investigation perspective, raising the bar sometimes means creating a paper trail. And I don't mean that in some sinister or cute way, but being able to prove to someone who's challenging your actions amidst this pandemic after the fact hey, look what we did. Here's a record of it. Here are some board minutes. Here are some actions we took. Here's the log of all the meetings we had. Something to satisfy someone who's challenging what you did during this time of crisis. Let's move along, please. This is more of the same in terms of the importance of oversight. Some examples of areas of inquiry that we've been discussing with our clients, and I'm sure my colleagues on the phone have been doing with some of you, talking about ensuring that you have good processes in place for disaster recovery or business continuity, supply chain interruption. We heard about other stresses on the business. Obviously, we've heard a bunch about available loans or grants or the like, but making sure that those are pursued and there's a record of pursuing them if you qualify. And of course, cyber and data privacy, which I'm not going to rehash, which we just heard, which was excellent, but making sure that you have a record of marrying the legal and the technical and the accounting so that everyone's on the same page in terms of these types of threat to the business. Let's move along, please. In terms of a core response team, as I said before, a lot of our clients are putting together and have already obviously put together multidisciplinary task forces or teams, not just a group of folks who are in the same part of the company, but legal, finance, accounting, insurance, whatever is appropriate to have a multidisciplinary team to have the best and brightest minds help steer companies through this crisis. Some have a single crisis coordinator, others have different structures, but as I said before, it's important to put some processes in place that could be adhered to as opposed to aspirational. No one really does them. Moving along, more of the same on some level in terms of how often should management and boards meet. As I said before, it's important to create a record. It does depend on the industry. It does depend on how big a company you are. The expectations, obviously, for a small cap company are different for those on a Microsoft or Amazon or the like. So you have to fit to size. But boards shouldn't just be doing, and management shouldn't just be doing, triage. That's what's top of mind right now, and that's what everyone's focused on for good reason. But I would say, again, looking in hindsight after the crisis, God willing, clears, to make sure that you've taken an opportunity from a commercial perspective, as I'm sure you all are, to look at what opportunities there could be, whether through the government funding or grants or the like, or business combinations, acquisitions, whatever, to show that you've been thoughtful and creative during this time and haven't just buried your head in the sand. That's more of a commercial thing, but that becomes important legally if someone challenges, what did you do to save the company or to protect the company? Let's move along, please, to the next slide. We've all heard a lot about government stimulus. Just from a high level word of caution from the lawyer in the room, obviously, when you're taking money from the government, you need to be careful and follow the rules. I don't say that to be condescending, but there's a lot of risks associated with it. We even saw cynically, after the credit crisis, 12 years ago already at this point, when the Obama administration came into power, and I don't mean to be political, they banked a bunch of the banks who kind of stepped up during the crisis and brought enforcement actions and investigations against them for alleged misconduct in connection with helping right the economy. I mention that here because anytime you're taking money from the government, it can have a cost. That doesn't mean don't take it. It just means make sure you follow the rules. And obviously, accountants like the folks at Citrin Cooperman and others can help make sure that those rules are followed and adhered to. If you're a government contractor and actually have business relations with the government, that has a whole nother set of risks. These are the kinds of things to be extra special, mindful of from a False Claims Act perspective and other interactions with the government. Moving along, company disclosures. So the SEC is still open for business. So if you're a public company, or even if you're not, but you're making disclosures to investors upon which they rely, the SEC is still open for business. I know this from personal experience because we're dealing with enforcement on a regular basis for a number of clients, but they've come out with a number of pronouncements, and I'll allude to a few of them later, with respect to company disclosures. So obviously you always want to make sure your disclosures are accurate because you don't want to open yourself up to securities fraud or other actions by government or private litigants. But in light of COVID-19 and all the unprecedented events that are occurring, do you need to give some thought as to earlier guidance that you've put out to the market? Do you need to review it? Do you need to change it? Obviously, a lot of stocks have been dropping. Some have been going up in recent weeks, but more often than not, they've been down on the year. And undoubtedly, lawyers, plaintiffs' lawyers, will find theories to argue that disclosures were not sufficient regarding the risks. And a question of who knew what when and when was that disclosed are always the basic questions that get asked. So in terms of company disclosure, it's something worth evaluating with Securities Counsel and accountants, obviously, with respect to the financials. Moving along, please. With respect to stock price declines, as I referenced, activist shareholders are circling the wagons. Boards and management should consider talking with folks about shareholder rights plans or poison pills, other steps you can take in anticipation of activist shareholders, at the gates. Some of them are already there, but it's something to be mindful of. When a stock price declines, it opens yourself up to all sorts of risks from a legal perspective and a commercial perspective. Pivoting for a minute to the next slide, and Ken spoke about the importance of the folks on the front lines. Obviously, we echo his comments and thoughts and prayers with all of them, but even just from a basic employee perspective and from a legal regulatory perspective, companies' top priorities, of course, are keeping people safe, whether they're at work, at a physical plant, or going to be coming into work soon, or anything else. That's the top priority. And that's what folks will expect in hindsight. So that means that typical safety measures have to be enhanced. There are folks who are experts in OSHA and other rules with respect to workplace safety. If you're in management or on a board or in legal at a company, you want to make sure you're up to date on the latest state, local, and other applicable guidelines, because what was applicable yesterday may not be applicable tomorrow. So on some level, it's exhausting. And my firm, for example, we have a COVID-19 landing page, and I know Citron Cooperman's been sending out lots of great alerts as well, but Pillsbury has a robust COVID-19 page for all the legal issues that I've been alluding to and many others. It's exhausting even just to keep up internally, because we pump out half a dozen alerts or so a day because we have clients across so many industries. But when it comes to employee safety, it's very state by state and local. So it's something that's worth keeping up to date, whether through your law firm or somebody else who's keeping track of all the appropriate guidelines. Moving along, and I should have had this slide too earlier, so I apologize for being a bit out of order. Ken spoke about the risk of insider trading concerns. I will add this: the SEC made very clear a few weeks ago that not only is it open for business, but it's minding the store. You've all probably read about investigations with respect to certain members of Congress who allegedly engaged in insider trading after they knew material non-public information about the risks to the economy as a result of COVID-19. It's been widely publicized. I'm actually helping a client, not a congressperson, but another client, in connection with the SEC investigation. So it's very real. So what does that mean for everyone? It means that in normal peacetime, of course, nobody should engage in insider trading. But today, the SEC is even on heightened alert with respect to those risks. And as we heard earlier in the presentation, there's heightened risk overall when folks are working from home. People kind of relax. I'm giving this presentation in sweatpants because I was told I wouldn't be on camera. So people let their guard down. As we heard a few minutes ago, people do stupid things and you can't really teach stupid. So with respect to insider trading, it means from a company perspective to refresh and renew policies and procedures, make sure employees are warned about it and made aware that this risk continues to exist and the SEC is all over it. Moving along, I want to just have a couple quick slides on M&A transactional issues. It merits a deeper dive for another day. I did an hour-long CLE with the head of our private equity practice a couple weeks ago on M&A private equity issues in the age of COVID-19, but I wanted just to touch upon it here. Obviously, there's a number of COVID-19 issues that implicate the way we do deals, diligence perhaps being the most important. We heard about cyber and IT, and that is core, when considering whether to do a transaction with another company to see how good their controls are and how strong their fraud prevention is. So diligence takes on an even more important form now with virtual data rooms and the inability to kick the tires in a physical sense. Next slide, please. Of course, from a financial projections perspective and an accounting perspective, to make sure you understand that any target company is still comfortable with its projections, understanding more about the finances of a target company, and ensuring that that diligence is done correctly. Not that this is different than what you would do normally, but I would say again, it's enhanced because of the fluid nature of the financial health of any target company. Cyber, just to touch upon for a minute from a legal perspective, the next slide, please, without belaboring the point. The headline here from a legal perspective is cyber is of top concern to the SEC and state regulators, attorneys general and the like. They continue to roll out alerts and guidance and beef up their own teams. I'm sure everyone has heard plenty about the importance of it. We heard some great advice earlier in this presentation on cyber IT and data privacy. I will tell you from a regulatory perspective, the expectation is high. The government will not look kindly on folks who are not continuing to invest and improve and tweak all the controls that you have internally on this. And again, one size doesn't fit all, depends on the size of your business. The expectations for Google are different than expectations for a small company, but it's something that should be tailored appropriately. Moving along quickly, we talked about employees from a workplace culture and making sure that we promote the health within a workplace culture. We've all been sensitized appropriately to being compliant with sexual harassment and an overall healthy workplace culture through the Me Too movement and other important movements. The fact that folks are working remotely, sort of relaxes people, as we've alluded to before. I have gotten a ton of emails from friends with all sorts of funny memes and jokes about coronavirus. A lot of it's really funny. My father now sends me 4 or 5 a day, and I've urged him to send it to my Hotmail because a lot of them are just not work appropriate. And he's 75, and I'm happy that he's emailing and has a good sense of humor. But as you know, if you send something around, what I find funny, somebody else may find offensive. So that's not to lecture morality, but it's just to remind folks who are responsible for that within organizations that we're at, again, a heightened risk because of all the email traffic, texts, and other online things that people are doing to relieve themselves of stress, just to be mindful of it. Let's move along, please. I've been on dozens and dozens of calls, and this is a bit self-serving, but it's genuine and true. Our firm has one of the 2 or 3 biggest insurance policyholder practices in the country, only representing policyholders. We have 50 lawyers across the country. I don't mean that as an infomercial, but I mention it because obviously you've all read a lot about business interruption insurance coverage. I know that the folks at Citron Cooperman have sent out some very helpful alerts on it because Ken and I have been talking about those. But I will share with you that our folks are drinking water from a fire hose because more often than not, brokers will tell clients, oh, you don't have coverage, either because they're lazy or they see the word virus somewhere in there. And I'm not disparaging our friends who are brokers. We work very closely with a lot of them since we have a big policyholder practice, but a lot of them are not lawyers, and a lot of them are not trained to look deeper. And at this moment, we're working with literally dozens and dozens of clients across a variety of industries, of course, hospitality, real estate, retail, and others that are being hit very hard, to review their insurance policies and not to take anything for granted. So I would urge folks who have obviously insurance to work with your brokers, work with whoever your outside counsel is, and look under every stone, because the insurance companies have sent a very loud message saying no, 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 but that's not the end of the inquiry, and I wouldn't give up on it. So next slide, just to wrap up, some practical steps are laid out on this one. No need to go through all of them. It kind of summarizes some of the themes that I've touched upon. And I guess last slide, if you could flip to it, and we heard this, just before I spoke in terms of the real world examples of people doing, I'll call it stupid things. I'm often brought in to scare folks within an organization, and I'm not that scary on a phone. Not that I'm that scary in person, but it's easier in person to explain that one bad text and one stupid email or other form of communication that I'm not even familiar with can destroy a litigation or an investigation. And we'll often tell folks, usually it's the younger people at a company or on a team, that they don't want to end up on the cover of the Wall Street Journal. That shows how dated I am. I'll have to come up with a new analogy, not to show up on some social media feed or something, but I'm sure you all understand the point that any email, text, or messaging will be seen in the light of day if the government looks at something that went wrong with your company during the crisis, or if a motivated private litigant is trying to do the same. So I urge folks to have caution. I hope that's helpful. I'll turn it back to our host. There's a CLE verification code on the next page, which I'm duty bound to call to your attention so folks can get CLE credit. And I'll turn it back.
Great. So this is Dave Roth again. So we have a handful of questions, and I'll try to summarize some of them. One of the questions is for me is, what is the one thing you would ask a company owner to do today to protect themselves against fraud? I think one of the most critical things, and especially in this day and age, is having the company owner understand what they're trying to protect, right? There's limited resources, and there's only so much dollars that can go around to protect the company without slowing down the business. So doing things like understanding your sensitive data, understanding your critical applications, and then going through a process to see that you have the controls in place to appropriately manage, those systems and associated data. We would typically looking at various frameworks, sets of controls. There's different projects that we get involved with, but those would be things that would be really good for an owner to look at and understand from a maturity perspective how mature the company wants to be specifically. Next question is for Ken. Ken, one of the questions is related to what warning signs should I be looking for to alert me as to whether there could be fraud happening under my nose?
Yeah, I think there are a number of aspects to that. I think, obviously you want to look at any anomalies that might be jumping out from your financial statements, from any of your accounts, specifically on the procurement side. You'd want to scrutinize whether in fact there have been any newly established vendors that might have come up in the last few months. And then take a look at those vendors and establish, what the rationale was for using them. You might want to look at the addresses that those locations are at and see if they connect in with any of your employees or potential connections. And really, at the end of the day, you want to listen to your employees, listen to your customers. If you have a hotline, I urge you to be focused. Sometimes clients will say, oh, we have a great hotline, and you ask them the question, well, how many responses have you gotten? And they'll say, oh, we haven't gotten any. That always raises concerns for me. I would want to see some activity in that space, and I would want to make sure that anybody who does access that information knows that you're looking, follow up on those accusations so that people feel like there is something that's actually being done as a result of their question.
Thank you, Ken. A couple more questions. One from Mike. Mike, what's the best way for me to determine if my company is vulnerable to a cyber attack, especially with many of my employees working remotely?
All right, well, a few answers to that one. First of all, I guess if you haven't gone through a risk assessment process at this point, I think something like Dave mentioned a minute ago, that's key to understand where your potential weaknesses are based on how you conduct business. But on top of that, if for some organizations that have invested in security information, event management systems, or SIMs, or have a managed SIM provider, they should be monitoring their logs and activity. A lot of smaller companies don't have those tools. And for those, we usually recommend having external vulnerability scans or penetration tests performed. Think of a vulnerability scan as a way for someone to evaluate whether it's possible to get into your network, looking at ports from the outside, checking whether you have upgraded software and applications that are protecting your network from the outside, which are very easy to do. And then a penetration test being, if you're able to get through that first thing, how deep can you get into the company? That it's always better to have somebody professional on your side test whether you're vulnerable than having a hacker do it and then have to respond. And then finally, we talked about employees being the weakest link. So if you haven't done a cybersecurity training program, have one in place. But if you have, a good way to test their readiness is do a spear phishing campaign. Again, using a third party to go through a campaign where it'll actually send your employees fake phishing emails to see whether they actually click on it. Do they open the email? Do they click on it? Do they enter their credentials? And that can then circle back to your education. And if you do have issues, you can focus on those pockets of issues within the company.
Great, thanks. Thanks a lot, Mike. This one I think is for Ari. I'm a private company. What can I do to protect myself against the federal government coming back to me and saying that I used the federal assistance dollars inappropriately?
Hi. First of all, make sure you use them appropriately. And by that, I don't mean to be a wise guy. That means be aware of what the rules are. I know they're very specific. We, for example, at our firm have a COVID-19 task force that meets every week among the partners, like 30 or 40 of us. And there are a handful who are in our DC office who have ripped apart every piece of the CARES Act and related stimulus and are working with businesses from small to large to make sure that they comply with the SBA loan program, and typically in conjunction either with a bank that are often facilitating the loans. So for example, I have a family business that my father runs who's working with his bank, a big bank, to ensure that they get the application. The bank is both facilitating it, and because it's a big bank, it has a strong legal and compliance team in place to help at least share the rules with my father's small business. And then he's bouncing it off of me and my colleagues where he needs, because they're pretty technical. Again, I'm dangerous on this. I understand a certain amount has to be used for payroll, a certain amount could be used for utilities or rent. So I would work with folks who are expert and have ripped it apart, either at an accounting firm and or law firm, to help give you that type of advice.
All right, that's great. Thank you. We also have a lot of COVID content that's on the Citrin Cooperman webpage with different contacts. If you want to have any other additional questions or reach out to anybody on this call. With that said, I think that's all for the questions that were asked. And by all means, please reach out to myself or any of the other folks on the call. Our information's all on the website itself, and we appreciate you taking the time to join.